What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. In this video, I'm going to share a simple 3-step process to find bass on any lake in the country in under 2 hours. I know it sounds too good to be true, but stay tuned because after you watch this video, you're going to be a lot more efficient and effective at finding bass. The first step for finding bass on any lake across the country is identifying the primary food source on your lake. The primary forage for the bass on your lake is going to vary depending on the region of the country you're in and the type of lake you're fishing. Here's a simple graphic showing the primary food sources on different types of lakes in different regions of the country. In general, bass on southern reservoirs are going to key on shad the majority of the time, whether that's a threadfin shad, gizzard shad, or blueback herring. However, in certain times of the year, they can also key really heavily on bluegill and crawfish. On natural lakes up north, bass tend to feed more on your panfish, like bluegill and perch, though they will feed on alewife, golden shiner, and crawfish as well. There are also some types of forage that are extremely regional, and you may find that the primary forage on your lake is something completely out of the ordinary, like a sculpin or a tilapia. I've even heard of bass keying on chipmunks up north. That's something Matt Steffen shared with me. So you definitely want to do some research on your lake to see which primary forage the bass are going to be feeding on, depending on the time of year you're fishing and the specific lake you're going to be on. After identifying the 2 or 3 types of forage that the bass in your lake are likely to key on, you want to go find that type of forage on your lake before you ever make a cast. There are several ways to do this. If you're looking for shad, for example, you can start by graphing out in the middle of the lake with your down imaging, 2D sonar, and side imaging. Baitfish are going to look like big clouds on down imaging or 2D sonar, and also bigger blobs on side imaging. If you use your electronics, you can oftentimes figure out not only if shad are in the area, but also the depth of the shad are in. Oftentimes, if the shad are positioned in 5 to 10 feet of water, the bass will also be setting up in that same depth range. If you don't have a fish finder, another easy way to find baitfish on your lake is to look for birds of prey. Just run down the lake and look for a bank that has 2 or 3 blue heron or cormorants setting up on that bank. They'll be set up on laydowns, shallow rocks, or anything close to the shoreline. If you see those birds, it's likely that baitfish are in the area. Run over there, and if the bait are there, you'll usually see them kicking on the surface, and you'll know that you're in the right spot. Now, if the primary forage on your lake is panfish, like bluegill or perch, you can also use your electronics and nature cues to find this type of forage. If you're looking for bluegill specifically on southern reservoirs, you can find them setting up on bluegill beds all summer long by using your side imaging, or the perspective mode on Garmin LiveScope, or even 360 imaging on a Humminbird unit. Just look for these small honeycombs in 1 to 15 feet of water, and the bass will be around them. You can visually see these same bluegill beds, if the water is clear enough, by just going down the bank with a good pair of polarized sunglasses and looking for those honeycomb beds up shallow. Now let's say you've tried to find shad and panfish on your lake. You've covered a 2-mile stretch of that lake and you haven't seen anything on both your fish finder or visually with your eyes. In this case, the bass are probably still in that 2-mile section of the lake, but they're not feeding on either the shad or the bluegill. My general rule of thumb is that if I spend over 45 minutes in a 2-mile stretch of a lake and don't see any shad or panfish, I assume that the bass are feeding on some type of bottom forage, crawfish, gobies, or sculpin. In this scenario, I'm going to look for the thickest rock I can find, whether that's a rock pile offshore or chunk rock down the bank. These are the key places that these bottom feeding forage are going to be setting up. And if you don't find any panfish or shad in your area, those bass are going to be keying on those crawfish, and you can catch a lot of good fish in those rocky areas. Really quick, if you're enjoying the detailed instruction in this video, then head to our website, fishthemoment.com, and check out our virtual seminars page. Here you'll find seminar recordings from past seminars we've done on a variety of bass fishing topics, from seasonal bass movement, electronics, offshore bass fishing, and how weather affects bass. These are 3-hour seminars with extremely detailed graphics and instruction that we spend hours putting together so that they're extremely clear and impactful. If you want to take your fishing to the next level and enjoy the content on this channel, definitely check out our virtual seminars because I know you'll love the content. Check them out at fishthemoment.com. After finding the primary forage for the bass on your lake, you're going to have a lot of key pieces of information that will help you find bass quickly. The first is the general area that the bass are going to be setting up in. On reservoirs, that might be the first half of a creek. the main lake, or the back half of the creek. On a natural lake, that might be up on top of a major flat, closer into the inside weed line, or off the flat in the deeper water areas. You'll also know the general depth range you need to be targeting in that section of the lake. If you find your baitfish in 15 feet of water, it's very likely the bass are also setting up in 15 feet. If most of the bluegill or perch beds that you find are in 5 feet of water, that's your key depth range. The one tricky situation is when the fish are feeding on bottom-type forage, like crawfish or gobies. In this situation, you may have to fish shallow rock, as shallow as 2 feet of water, but also deep rock as deep as 30 feet of water, to figure out which depth range the bass are using. Step 2 in this 3-step process is to find some type of cover that's in close proximity to the baitfish you just found. Cover can come in a ton of different forms, depending on the lake you're on. Your lake could have lots of docks, or maybe lily pads, riprap, shallow laydowns, or any other type of shallow cover. Offshore, you might have brush piles, standing timber, rock piles, shell beds, the list goes on and on. In my experience, it doesn't really matter the specific type of cover that you're fishing. As long as the baitfish or the primary forage that you're targeting is in close proximity to that type of cover, you're in business. To be clear, when I say within close proximity, I basically mean that the primary forage is within 0 to 30 feet of the cover that you found. For example, if you found a bank with a bunch of gizzard shad on it, and there's laydowns down that bank, you want those gizzard shad to be either right up in those laydowns or within 20 to 30 feet just out in front of them. What you'll find is that gizzard shad won't always just be up in those laydowns. They'll sometimes move into the laydowns, feed for a bit, move back out and sit over the channel, and then move back in. But the bass are not going to necessarily move in and out with those gizzard shad. Instead, they'll just stay hanging around that laydown, and you can just target those laydowns because that's the ambush point for those bass. Another example would be shallow bluegill beds in a pocket. Let's say that the primary cover in this pocket is a boat dock. In this scenario, you don't necessarily need to have that boat dock be right next to those bluegill beds, let's say 5 feet away from it. Instead, you can have that dock be 20 to 30 feet away from that bluegill bed. Then, if any of those bluegill swim out of that bed and get closer to the dock, the bass that are sitting in the shadow or shade of that dock can jump out and ambush those baitfish. Really, all you need is to have baitfish within 20 to 30 feet of a good piece of cover. If you have those two pieces together, you're very likely to find some bass. This goes for both shallow and offshore fishing, and there are so many different combinations of cover, depth, and forage that we could cover, but I'm not going to go through all of them. Really, again, the key is to find some type of cover that's close to some type of forage that you feel like the bass are feeding on. And if you know the general depth range that those baitfish are in, that's even better. If the baitfish are in 20 feet of water, look for cover in that 20-foot zone. If the baitfish are in 2 feet of water, look for cover in that 2-foot depth zone, and you should be good to go. The third and final step to find bass is going to vary depending on whether you're fishing offshore or shallow. If you're fishing offshore, the third step is pretty simple. You're going to graph areas where you find baitfish close to cover, and then try to identify bass using your electronics. For example, if you graph over a brush pile, you want to see dots set up around that brush pile that are spaced apart with a decent amount of space, and are stacked no more than 3 dots tall. These are going to be bass. I have complete guides on how to identify bass versus other species of fish on your fish finder, and I'll leave links down below to those videos. You can also identify bass using your side imaging and with 2D sonar. There's a lot of ways with electronics to know if an area has bass, so as long as you're pretty good at interpreting your electronics and you watch those videos linked down below, it should be pretty easy to know if there are bass in that area. If you graph a spot, for example, with cover and baitfish but don't see bass, don't get discouraged. Graph 3, 4, or 5 more areas with a similar forage cover combination, and eventually you're going to run into bass. My general rule of thumb is that I need to graph 5 to 10 areas where there are both cover and forage together until I find a group of bass. Not every piece of cover with forage will hold bass, but if you hit enough of them and graph enough of them with your electronics, eventually you're going to run into a piece of cover with bait and bass. Now on the flip side, if you're fishing up shallow, the process is a little bit different. Instead of identifying the fish with your fish finder, you need to identify the fish with your bait. The way I do this is I run several pieces of cover with bait fish around them using a variety of baits. I'm going to make no more than 5 casts per piece of cover. I might try to make a couple casts with a moving bait like a spinnerbait or a crankbait, then make a few casts with a slower moving bait like a Texas rig worm or a wacky rig. My goal is to fish 10 to 15 pieces of cover pretty quickly where I see both cover and bait fish in close proximity. If you hit enough pieces of cover with a variety of baits, eventually you're going to run into a bass. In general, you're going to find that bass offshore are more likely to group up on isolated pieces of cover, and you don't need to graph as many pieces of cover offshore to run into bass, again 5 to 10. But up shallow, the bass are a little more pressured, and they don't like to group up as much on a single piece of cover like a dock or a laydown, so you're going to have to fish more pieces of cover to actually run into bass. Fortunately, it's a little bit easier to visually identify cover up shallow than it is to graph it with a fish finder. So overall, the time to actually get a bite is usually going to be similar if you're equally skilled fishing shallow versus using your electronics and fishing offshore. In summary, the 3 steps to find bass are to first, identify the areas that have the primary forage your bass are feeding on. That includes the general area of the lake and the depth that those bait fish or forage are in. Step 2 is to identify cover in close proximity to the primary forage you've identified. Step 3 is to actually locate those fish using your fish finder offshore or your fishing lure up shallow. This 3-step process seems very straightforward and almost too good to be true, but it's a little bit harder to implement on the lake than you would think. The first reason for this is because a lot of anglers want to immediately start fishing when they get to the lake. They want to pick up a rod and start casting at the shoreline, regardless of whether there is good cover, bait fish, or fish in a given area. This process requires you to spend at least 45 minutes to as much as 2 hours trying to find areas with bait fish, cover, and bass before you ever start fishing. My general timeline for my fishing day is that I spend the first 30 to 45 minutes finding bait fish and determining what depth they're in and general area they're in. I'll then spend another 30 to 45 minutes identifying the key pieces of cover close to those bait fish. Finally, I'll spend 30 to 45 minutes either graphing those areas with my fish finder to find the fish or fishing with a variety of lures to get my first bite. All in all, this process takes between an hour and a half to 2 hours for me to actually get my first fish in the boat and find them on any lake that I start fishing. Therefore, this process isn't going to be for everyone. If you're really impatient and just want to start casting right when you get to the lake, this is probably not going to work out very well for you. And also, if you have a very limited time on the water, it's also going to take up a lot of time, at least an hour and a half to 2 hours, to get this process to start working. But if you do have enough time on the water and you're struggling to find bass, this process is proven to work, at least by me, on lakes all across the country, from down south to up north. You have to figure out what your forage is on your lake. That's really key. You don't want to be looking for bait fish like shad or gizzard shad on a northern lake, or look for gobies, for example, on the southern lake, if that's just not the primary forage for your lake. So it does take a little bit of homework ahead of time. Know what the primary forage is on your lake, then either use your electronics or visual nature cues to find those bait fish, find the cover, and you're going to find the bass. Try this process next time you go to the lake. Give it a shot. Put the rods in the rod locker, lock them up for 2 hours, and just try looking around your lake. Open up your senses and try to find some fish before you start casting. If you do, you're going to be a lot more efficient and effective at finding bass on your lake, and it's definitely going to reduce the number of days that you go home without catching a single fish. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a comment down below. Also like the video, it helps us with the YouTube algorithm. If you want more content like this from Fish the Moment, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future uploads. Thanks again for checking out this video. We'll see y'all next one.